Are you ready to explore the unknown? Dive into the world of the strange, mysterious, and unexplained with Eerie Expeditions magazine. Each issue is packed with spine-tingling tales, cutting-edge paranormal investigations, and exclusive insights into hauntings, cryptids, UFOs, and more. Whether you're a seasoned investigator or just love a good ghost story, Eerie Expeditions magazine has something for you. Join our growing community of truth seekers and adventure lovers. Subscribe today at EerieExpeditionsMagazine.com and unlock the secrets of the supernatural. Are you ready? That's EerieExpeditionsMagazine.com, where the extraordinary is just a click away. Dare to discover.
What's out there? What creates the shadows in the corners or the creatures of the dark? Who are those on the other side? What do they have to say? This is the Gateway Podcast. This is not your normal style of paranormal talk radio. Brought to you live from United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM New Orleans.
Hello, everybody. How are you? This is C.L. Thomas, your host. Welcome to the Gateway, broadcast live from United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM New Orleans. Hello from San Francisco. I want to give a special shout out tonight to Sean Kelly, the host of Into the Night. That's the show that comes on right before mine. He also airs on Sundays as well. Sunday evenings, I believe, around maybe 6 o'clock, or is it 5 o'clock on the Pacific time. I hope everyone is doing well. The weather here in San Fran is cold and rainy. And yes, I am not from San Francisco. I'm a long ways away. Normally I'm from Las Vegas, but here I am. I'm in this part of the country, and I really don't know a whole lot about San Francisco. I do have a trip coming up to Alcatraz later this week and a few other haunted spots around town. I am going to visit the waterfront too. But for those listening, if you know anywhere in San Francisco that's haunted, let me know, because I'm looking for places to go while I'm here. So those that have listened to me over the past few months know that I often talk about the idea that we are more than our physical body. And it's an idea that I got from studying the works of Robert Monroe and his whole series with the Gateway and what he was doing in the 70s. And actually the show is named after what his work. So what does that mean when it comes to the paranormal world or in magic in general? My guest tonight has researched a lot into necronetics in the dark depths of the occult to shed light on ancient rituals. So tonight we are going to jump into some big rabbit holes on the power of necronetics intentions and the great I am. So without further ado, I welcome Nathaniel Gillis. Nathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you, and I'm excited to talk about the research.
So, hey, listen, do you go by Nathaniel or Nathan? I forgot to ask you before coming on.
Nathaniel's fine. It's either or, but I prefer Nathaniel.
Okay, Nathaniel. For the topic tonight, before we get into that, how did you get into the paranormal?
So it was thrusted upon me at a young age. I was 8 years old when my parents moved into a haunted house, and I experienced a lot of manifestation there. So I saw a full-bodied apparition, shadow figures, disembodied voices, and that was kind of my introduction to the paranormal field. Since then, I mean, I'm 36 now, not to, wrap myself out here, but I'm no spring chicken, unfortunately. So since my 8-year-old experience, I've been diving headfirst into what it was I encountered, wondering if I was alone in that, and if I wasn't alone, what exactly all this represents to us, the species. But that's how I got into the field. It was just an immediate experience, and that was instrumental. And so that's what I experienced, and that's why I'm here.
So when it comes to necronetics, what is that exactly?
So it's a combination of necromancy and genetics. Through first of all, let me kind of back up and say that it's an intersection between necromancy and genetics. It's my attempt to understand how death, consciousness, and what I've considered biological inheritance, how all of that plays a role in hybridism, the missing fetus syndrome, possession and pregnancy throughout history. And so some of the case studies I've personally worked on has led me to believe that there is a species of practitioners right now on the earth that is self-replicating by virtues of insemination and implantation. And that's hopefully that's what it is. I'm still like right now I'm still working for a contextual framework, trying to simplify it right into just one sentence. But basically, it's the immersion of necromancy and genetics, because I believe that's what's going on. It's ritual magic and hybridism at the same time.
So is this kind of like along the lines of when you create a topa, for instance, where you're just putting your intention and energy into a specific outcome?
Yes. So my research early on was centered around incubi cases, right, throughout history. And that was always an entity that would appear to a woman in the image of a lover, a deceased husband, an ex-boyfriend. And so I started looking at the pathology that was present in those cases. That's when I realized that they weren't modern. This phenomenon goes back centuries, even to antiquity. And so when I kind of zoomed into these cases, I realized that they all shared a common pathology. And that was that it wasn't purely attraction or a physical appreciation of beauty that these entities had. It was quite literally the phenomenon stalking the victim, monitoring their fertility, and trying to inseminate them with a fetus. And so that's what kind of got me into this research. And I realize it's a niche field, but I think it's meaningful if we're going to understand hybridism, the hybrid program right now in ufology, as it pertains to history.
We can go into so many directions with this conversation, from like Rosemary's Baby to
it's vast.
When you look at it from the groundwork, though, of say ancient history, where you had the idea, like from biblical times, where the angels came down and they reproduced with humans at some point, or so they believe. And I forget the terminology for that. There's a term that they created.
Nephilim, Rephaim, the whole lore there. You're right, and it's not a modern phenomenon. It's quite an ancient presence. And the funny thing is that we can exchange terminologies, put on new titles and terms, but the phenomenology remains the same. It has not changed. They're constantly doing the same things with the same people in the same ways. And that's why, again, I believe that ufology has kind of hijacked hybridism. And, well, it's ours now, and it's really not.
Right.
Even it's not. It doesn't even belong to demonology, for that matter. It's an ancient phenomenon. And I think that it's beneficial to look at hybridism retroactively through an ancient lens to give us perhaps the proper context to what we're witnessing right now in ufology. But so that's what necronetics is. My study as research rather has led me to believe that at least some of these beings are practitioners, and there's reasons for that I can get into real quick. Number one of the main arguments in demonology was, how can a spirit leave secretions on an experiencer? That never made sense, and demonologists could never come to a conclusion because there was no data set for that, right? How can an entity, an ethereal entity, leave secretions on an experiencer? And then you also have case studies where the secretions left on the experiencer were accompanied by sigils on the skin, sometimes underneath their eyelids. And so when you have priests that are going into homes within an hour of the phenomenon manifesting, you had certain pathologies present in these case studies. And it was like, okay, what's really going on here? And so that's when I realized that if these entities are possessing secretions and excretions, then that leads me to believe they must have bodies. And if they have bodies, why is it, right? Why is it that there are accompanying sigils? So that's when I realized that at least some hybridism is the byproduct of ritual magic, self-replication, and a species of practitioner present who were employing their own sigils in order to facilitate the ritual they were performing. So this gets very dark very quickly. It's not my intention. I mean, honestly, it's not. It's just that's what Necronetics is. And that's kind of the foundation of my research.
I kind of want to get into the dark side a little bit, to be honest with you. And it's because, people really, honestly, people really don't talk about that very often. When it comes to ritual magic, they kind of skirt over that. And, they talk about the Wiccan, whatever. But then you have people like Aleister Crowley, who was trying to tap into so many different things. You had, you had the Nazis back in the 30s and 40s who, were they playing around with this stuff? I kind of think they were, because they were genetically trying to wipe out an entire race and create a master race. And they were using the occult to some extent to learn a lot of that stuff. So it's interesting.
Yes, and I think it does play a role in the phenomenon we're experiencing today. See, a lot of people, again, and I'm glad to be on your show, and I'm thankful that you are authentic enough, right, and confident enough to actually talk about this, because people don't want to. And I've long wondered, like, you can go to these different streaming services and they have all kinds of subject matter. Oh yeah, they never really want to dive into the nuance of the phenomenon, and they kind of want to separate the occult, ritual magic, ceremonial magic from ufology even. And that's like kind of what I've been wanting to do, is to say, listen, in order for us to get a proper understanding of what we're dealing with, we have to go back and ask deeper questions. And one of them, again, is why is it that ritual magic, ceremonial magic, is a feature in the phenomenon and not a bug? Why is it, right, that George Hunt Williamson was using homemade Ouija boards in order to contact extraterrestrials, right? Why is it that Albert Bender was building altars in his attic? Altars.
That's interesting.
A religious artifact, yes, in order to contact entities that called themselves aliens and extraterrestrials. And so the phenomenology is very strict, and it's alarming. Whatever these beings are, they do respond to ceremonial magic. And we're getting to some case studies here in a little bit. How much time do we have, by the way? Are we doing an hour or?
Oh yeah, we have about an hour. So about 7:10, they'll kick us off.
Okay, that's fine. So why is it that we have all of these accompanying religious artifacts present, and they're supposed to be extraterrestrial? George Hunt Williamson was channeling aliens when multiple voices came out of his mouth at the very same time. I had a case study like that. It was a murder case, and the murderer, in the middle of the act, her mouth was not moving, but a voice was coming out of her. Different gender. Fascinating. So my point being is that when we look at the phenomenology here, long before they were extraterrestrials, we knew them as spirits, and they were incarnating by virtue of seances, Ouija boards, channeling, the whole lot. And so what I'm looking at now is that there is a behavioral pattern that wants to kind of shift through all of the other older archetypes, but it wants all of the same religious artifacts. So it wants to be an extraterrestrial, but it wants ceremonial magic. It wants to be alien, but it also will respond to altars. So what this leads me to believe is that we're dealing with a primeval intelligence that is weaponizing various archetypes in order to moderate our species and our behavior. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Well, that's a concept too that's been going on forever too. But what is I'm trying to wrap my head around grouping the spirit world, like demons and that sort of thing, with aliens.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard.
It is until you look at the behavioral patterns. Again, Hybridization did not originate in ufology. It never was extraterrestrial. Some of the very first cases of incubi were literally people that thought they were copulating with deceased lovers or deceased husbands. And so when you look at that pathology and you start to see that it not only was, the incarnation of the archetype of the deceased, it was literally leading to impregnation and pregnancies, to the extent that, again, they were collecting excretions. Like Father Sinistrari of Amino was a Franciscan priest, and he goes into these houses and he's talking to incubi victims, and he's noticing that they have sigils underneath their eyelids, on their skin. And then he's also collecting secretions on their bodies and on their clothes. Now, as a phenomenologist, what I do is I look at that and say, okay, what's the difference between that account and Betty Hill's abduction, when they tried to copulate with her and they found the same secretions on her dress? There is no difference. The only separation is one calls itself an alien, extraterrestrial. The other one appears as a deceased lover or an uncle or something weird. It's very strange stuff. My point, though, is this sexual pathology is the exact same thing. And it also has led to impregnation and what we consider to be the missing fetus syndrome. So my position currently is not that it's not binary. It's not that they're either aliens or demons. My position is that they're neither. That there's something else out there that's wearing both of these models as masks, in that in order to get to the true nature of the phenomenon, the pathology, I'm willing to scrap all the terms and all the titles and look at it like a forensic pathologist. Not that I am one, but like studying a serial killer. Sure, they have aliases, but they're the same rituals and the same phenomenon. So that's my perspective.
Are there people right now who are practicing these rituals, and what's the outcome? Are they trying to create a different form of human race that's more powerful in some way? Is that the idea?
Yes. So all of my research, like Necronetics, is centered around certain data sets that I've encountered in these case studies. Number one, this is interreligious and cross-cultural. I've had cases an hour and a half from here. I had a case in India, same pathology. So essentially what occurs is that let's just say there's a woman. The phenomenon monitors her fertility. It knows when they've had hysterectomies. It knows. I don't know how. It does. Essentially, what will happen is an entity will manifest to the experiencer. It will induce them into a dreamlike state. And these are very important data points for everybody that's watching and listening. Induces her to a dreamlike state. It will appear as the husband or a former lover. They could be deceased or not. Doesn't really matter. And then it will kind of groom them into sometimes consensual, sometimes non-consensual relationships. Now, it will be so much like a nightmare that the experiencer thinks there's nothing to this, right? It's just a dream. Might as well let it happen. By the time the entity manifests, it shows up, right? It wears the interface of the husband or deceased lover. And then at the moment of insemination, it will stare into the eyes of the experiencer and then shapeshift into what it really looks like. Now, this is first described in Gnosticism in the Apocrypha of John. It talks about a species that was trying to self-replicate through the womb. It says that they manifested in the images of the husbands, but at the moment of conception, changed its shape, stared into the eyes of the experiencer. The goal, again, this is fascinating, it was an obstetric tradition. They believed that whatever man the woman was focused upon at the moment of conception, she will bear the material image of that entity as a fetus in her womb. And so it was the literal imprinting of the apparition into the biological avatar, which is the fetus. And so now you have this kind of archaic argument of the husband not being the father. the entity being the father. And so now you have the fetus whose literal body is identical to the apparition that fathered it in the incubus encounter.
Is this the story of Jesus?
That is a question I'm still wrestling with. Because if you look at that teaching, he was always saying, right, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Why is that?
Mhm.
It's quite possible that this, in fact, did take place, and then there was some kind of correction, right? That's the only way I could think of it, a correction in the Bible to where it was, if you're going to incarnate in this dimension, I am too, in the same way, right? That's the only way I can rationalize it. But all of those are present, and even down to the occult transference, which is what I believe as well. And I believe 100% that's why these incubi cases, again, they're not just the insemination and the secretions. They're accompanied by ritual magic and evidence of a ceremony being performed to where the practitioner, the sorcerer themselves, they will transfer their consciousness from the one body into the body of the fetus in order to prolong their existence. So that is necronetics. And necronetics is both the self-replication and the self-multiplication of the occult practitioner. That's what I believe is happening.
Do you have any research at all that Aleister Crowley was into this?
100%. Yes. He was trying to create what's called a moon child and again, using sex magic and chaos magic. But at the very end of his life, his son, how can I say this? He was trying to transfer his consciousness, and the individual that he was alleged to try to, I guess, he handed this individual something, and that's usually, it's called transference, where the practitioner's consciousness is tied to a metallic object or some other object, and it's handed to the individual they're trying to possess. And that's through the occult transference, that individual is now invaded by memories that don't belong to their personal experience. Well, the person that he handed the object to went in, and then Aleister Crowley died. That individual went on to become schizophrenic.
It's interesting.
Yes, and again, it's both it's called both the red rite and the ultimate black mass. But what I'm looking at again is not the self multiplication of the sorcerer, but the literal fragmentation of their own consciousness, to where you could have one entity, right, that is possessing multiple clones at the same time, creating replicas of the original prototype. And so this is what I believe is happening. And I think that this is evident in the pathology of possession, right? So possession throughout history, usually dominated by the Vatican, usually dominated by Catholicism. But if we took a multidisciplinary approach to it, we start to see the phenomenon start to emerge. And the evidence suggests that possession was not just the relocation of consciousness, but it was the attempt at the replication of life. I'm possessing a new avatar. And so that's why when you have cases like, okay, I'll give you one for instance. Okay, in the 17th century, they're called the Ursuline possessions. And it was a Catholic convent where, again, an incubus starts to appear to the nuns. And it used the same old archetypes. Like one individual witnessed her old confessor, one of her favorite priests who had died and went to the other side, began incarnating to her. So she's entertaining this priest, right? Thinking, okay, you're familiar, I'm safe with you, you're just an apparition, up until it started to do some very bad things to her. Is this okay? I don't want to get too crazy.
Oh yeah, no, this is perfect. I love this.
Okay. So
right
not just alley. That, right? So she starts to talk to her fellow nuns about this, She's like, I don't understand this, but it appears as my favorite confessor, but its behavior is completely antithetical to that individual. And so, sure enough, from that moment on, other nuns are coming forward saying, by the way, I wasn't going to say anything, but my favorite priest, one that was actually in the convent, right, that was the leader of it, he had died like 10 years prior. Now he's manifesting to them. And so the fascinating thing about this, or at least one of them, is that you have two different priests manifesting in the same convent. But
And both of
both
these
of them
priests both of them had passed on.
yes, absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. And so they were both allegedly different entities, which again, this teaches us about the pathology. Allegedly different people in life, and yet when it got down to the pathology, they were doing very bad things to people, women, and they were doing the same things. And so that's when they start to ask the question, right? In demonology, is this the same entity that's masquerading as various archetypes? Now, another common pathology in necronetics is that I don't want to say it like that, to copulate with leads to an act of possession. And so it wasn't just the bodily invasion of a physical object or something, it was literally the commandeering of their consciousness. And so this is why early demonologists, they constantly wrestled with, okay, were these beings in love with women, or right? Was there some kind of beauty that entrapped them, and they were just, it was weird. And they asked very strange questions. But these cases they don't make me think that it's beauty they're captured by. It was fertility. It was fertility. And I have cases that suggest that even as young as women entering puberty, one case is a 50-year-old that emailed me, and we talked for a few days about this, where she had been taken from her youth, and these beings were trying to replicate with her, right? She has dreamlike nightmares and just, visitations in the night. And she had a lot of gynecological issues, as they always do, these incubi victims. It's awful. Anyway, so one night she said she had just had surgery. She had a hysterectomy. Goes to bed. Phenomenon manifests. They start running tests on her body, and they realize that she had a hysterectomy, and they could no longer self-replicate. And that's when they began to abuse her and disappeared. So that's what they were doing with these nuns. Number one. Number two, and this is perhaps the most important, it was not different entities. It was a singular entity that was masquerading in the convent as both deceased priests. Let's take it a step further. After the original masquerading of the father, it began to distribute its consciousness among demoniacs in the convent. So now it's actively possessing these incubi victims. It's not just inducing them in dreamlike states. It's not just the physical scarrings and markings on their bodies. Now they're being possessed by the entity that had accosted them in the night.
Oh, wow.
So we're going to kind of unpack all of this. But my point is, there is a common pathology that's universal. And it's a very important note. Like, this is not the figment of their imagination. These are not the result of what people called external or internal pollutions, right? I'm manifesting this because I have repressed fantasies. No, it was an entity. And the goal, again, leading the evidence, when you have secretions left by the entity, along with sigils on the skin of the experiencer, what that entity is trying to do is transfer its consciousness from one object, one body, to another. And I 100% believe, and we'll get into some cases too, that the object he's trying to transfer into is the very fetus he is inseminating them with.
We're going to pause for just a second so we can get to some of the comments. Joe Fox says hello. Kara, I think, Qualqueer, I think that's how you pronounce it. Hey everyone, hugs from Brazil. Nathaniel's topics are really interesting, and his perspective highlights the intention and identity behind a phenomenon. Kimberly says hello. Mama Wooden. Hi, Nathaniel. Spiritists who maintain altars or bovadas often do see fluid residues in the glass of water. And then we have Sean is on. Hi, Sean. His show comes on right before mine. That's who I was talking to into the night. And then River says, good evening. And Joe Fox says, this stuff scares me. It kind of scares me too a little bit. And that's it for our comments so far. But, you know, I kind of want to ask a question. It might be a little off topic, but, and I'm really sorry if it is, but I once saw a guy, and this was right after Katrina. I was walking around New Orleans, and I was down in, I think it was the 7th Ward. They were getting ready to knock the whole thing down, bulldoze it. And the people were in there trying to take their stuff out. There was one guy who was a voodoo practitioner, and he was writing sigils on the side of the house because he wanted the spirits. He said he was trying to create a doorway for the spirits to exit the house and follow him back to his new home. So with that said, when these entities are putting sigils on the body, they're in sense creating like a gateway sort of thing.
Yes. Yes. So some of the earliest Mesopotamian texts, they were exorcistic texts. And so essentially the sigil was designed to do one of two things, to lock something in or to lock something out. So that's really what it is. But okay, I'm going to say this because I have a lot of people that follow my work and they get mad because I say the same thing. Like, well, they're my case studies, right? I'm not just going to make up more case studies I never had, right? Anyway, so I'm going to go ahead for the people that are new to my research. The evidence that I'm collecting now suggests that at least some of the aliens or extraterrestrials are also practitioners. Some of the sigils that we're finding on abductees are the same sigils we're finding on demoniacs. Now, again, people need to understand what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting they're demonic or that they're alien. I believe that we're dealing with something much deeper, much darker, something that's, I call the proto-intelligence, that's hiding beyond archetypes, manipulating our species. But the fact remains that whatever species we're dealing with transcends modern occultism. You know, I worked with the remote viewer Sun, and please don't, people are going to watch, like, you always told this story 1,000 times. I know, but everybody's new here. So here's what I mean.
Heard the story, so.
Okay, so I did a lecture one night on skin anomalies and scarifications on experiencers and how it correlates with demoniacs. Got an email from an individual who said that his father was a famous remote viewer and that his father would go in and out of his body and meet his guides, and they would give him insights and prophecies. Anyways, he said one night his father went into a session, and when his father got back into his body, he's now stumbling down the stairs. He's crying uncontrollably. He's clutching his chest, and he's inconsolable. Well, as they're talking to him, he collapses, has a massive heart attack. The EMS arrives. They're, pumping and trying to revive him. They're getting him. Well, when they're taking his shirt off, from underneath his skin, hieroglyphics in amulets began to move from underneath the skin to the surface. Sigils. One was the Star of David. The next one was a cross. And then there was, at one time, this happened multiple times in his sessions, at one time was an overarching Egyptian hieroglyphic. So they asked him, once they got him calmed down at the hospital, they asked him what happened. He said, well, he goes, I went into my regular session. He says, now, this is supposed to be just him with his guides, but it sounds like an abduction. He says he leaves his body like he always does, but now he goes to a different location than usual. Now he's in a metallic room. There's a metallic bench, metallic table, and that he's flanked on the right and left sides by entities. And he said, at first blush, I believe them to be my guides who've always been there for me. They're the ones giving me the prophecies. They're why I'm there. He said, but when I start to look around and observe my environment, so I realized that something was very much off, and that these seem to be imposters mimicking my guides. So that's when he realized, I've got to leave. Somehow I've got to get out of here as soon as I can. He said that when he realized that, they did too. And that's when they shapeshifted into something inhuman. He's slammed back into his body, and now he has burning sensations from underneath his skin to the surface. Now, these are sigils. Now, to go even deeper, and this is why, again, the pathology does not match that of the demonic, because demons don't have sigils. They don't use sigils in order. No, practitioners use sigils as pictorial signatures of the demonic. But demons don't carve sigils into people. The fundamental flaw in the model of the demonic. So when I started realizing that, I started thinking, why is it, right, that it's not just sigils, but even incubi victims have sigils. And I'm working on a case now that it's one of Dr. Carla Turner's experiencers. It's actually her son, where this woman was abducted by alleged aliens. But when she's returned, the next morning she's covered from head to toe in sigils. The same burning sensation, to the point where this individual told me they had to take her to the ER, and the doctor said, well, I've never seen these before. They would have wrapped her up in a heated blanket because the burning hurt too much. And then miraculously, the same sigils that arrived out of nowhere would disappear all at once in 3 days.
So they disappear from your body, the sigils.
Right. Whatever we're dealing with transcends both models, right? Extraterrestrial and the demonic. It's something, and this is just my perspective, it's another species of practitioner, of the adept, that exist. And I think the reason they're controlling the narrative, and the reason they're wanting, right, the same altars, but now they're extraterrestrials, is because they're trying to cover their tracks. A lot of this is deeply rooted in ritual and ceremonial magic, and they don't want us to understand that.
It's wow. But can people use this instead of trying to tap into this energy to change the human race or whatever it is that they're trying to do? Do they tap into this for another reason, like say to get some kind of technological advance? I'm thinking of the case with who's that rocket scientist, that Jack Parsons?
Oh yes, yes, Jack Parsons, JPL. Yes, 100%.
Yes, when he was wasn't he into the occult, and he was trying to create a rocket at one time, but also there's documentation where he was trying to actually create a woman for himself, basically, like a lover or something. This is in the 1920s. I can't remember.
Yes, so that during their sex magic they would create something else.
Right.
And so what we're looking at here, and this is another common fallacy in the field, is that science and spirituality are mutually exclusive, right? They're a dichotomy, and that doesn't seem to be what we're witnessing right now. They're not a dichotomy, they're a duality. And right now, even like Tim Taylor and other people right now in the scientific community and the aerospace community, their model of the phenomenon is literally built in performing rituals in order to get technology.
And that's what Jack Parsons did. And he actually did create a rocket from that, or so he says.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I lived 10 minutes away from Wright Pat Air Force Base. In the 1950s, there were groups of practitioners at the Air Force Base. And what they were doing, and this says a lot about the phenomenon, by the way, right? What they were doing is they were building altars, they were performing esoteric rituals, and the phenomenon, as a result, as a secondary consequence to the ceremony being performed, it would partially manifest and materialize technology, blueprints. And then our scientists would, you have an engineer? Come here. What is that? What am I looking at? And they would draw blueprints, right? Take photographs of whatever they were seeing, and then go back and try to reverse engineer what the phenomenon was giving them. And so I'm to the point now as a researcher where I've kind of bled through all of the archetypes, right? I don't believe these are extraterrestrial. Extraterrestrials that are using ritual magic on people. So I had to adjust my worldview. And in order to do that, I had to abandon the dogma to embrace the data. And the data suggests, it's pattern confirming data, that whatever we're dealing with is not just tied to the occult, but they in and of themselves are a species. They're a species of practitioner. And the magic and ceremonial sorcery, if you will, that they're performing on us, the species, is transcendent. Whatever we have, I mean, I've collected sigils over the years, and some of them match what we're doing, like not us, obviously, but practitioners in this dimension. Whatever they're doing, it's almost as if they're performing the ritual on the soul itself. And then when that soul gets back into the body, the body begins to manifest the sigils that they used on the soul. Now, whatever that is, I don't even have a vocabulary for it.
I'm like wordless. I'm speechless.
It's a lot to take in.
It's a lot to take in. It really is. For the practitioner who is trying to tap into this energy on some level, does it become dangerous for them? Like I know Jack Parsons blew himself up. Lester Crowley kind of went crazy a little bit toward the end there, from what I read. But can it be, what happens to the person that's doing, and who are these people doing it? Is there a particular group of people?
Yes, I think they're both in the government, and then there are also practitioners that are lamb practitioners. Okay, like when you get into some of these rituals of the Thelema and Crowley's magic, you start to see that there is again this emerging pattern where it wasn't just lamb manifesting to Crowley, but lamb was almost another interface of the phenomenon. And what practitioners are doing right now is they're going into the rituals and they're focusing on the eyes of lamb. In focusing on the eyes of lamb while performing their ritual, they will almost enter into his eyes themselves, and it's just very elaborate. But my point here is that there are no rules. Let me break this down. Early on in my career, when I was going into investigations, I would often encounter two things. Number one, a pervasive manifest presence in the house that seemed to play by no rules. And then I would go into homes and see scratches, 666, markings on the body. And it was almost like, oh my God, it's demonic, right? Horns and hooves. And so I started to think sheepishly, well, okay, this makes sense, that these were co-present entities operating in the same household. It wasn't until I started looking at the pathology that I realized that they were not co-present. It was a singular intelligence. I was just looking at it different. They weren't co-present. They were the same thing, in that one intelligence was wearing the archetype of another. And so when I'm courting the demonic hypothesis, here's a demon, let's go, he's going to play by demonic rules, ta-da, here's what I got for you. That's when I noticed the shifting, boom. Now that proto-intelligence manifests, and it plays by no rules. Even the ritual magic that we're seeing today, like within 1952 here in Dayton, Ohio, what started happening was that they would draw circles of salt, hoping that the entity would stay within the circle. Why? Right? Because that's what they were told by the phenomenon. And then by the time they went through their ritual, the phenomenon incarnated, right? It switched archetypes. And now the proto-intelligence that had courted them as a demon led them to believe, communicate. When that happened, it switched archetypes. And now whatever incarnated in that circle of salt had no rules. Just like the entities that took out Jack Parsons. They didn't play by those rules, right? So they're not co-present. It's one phenomenon wearing another archetype. And then by the time we interface with it, it just switches eyes, switches hands, and we're left interfacing with something we really have no concept of.
So what happens when you take this magic on a grander scheme, like say the Nazis were doing some sort of occult practice during World War II? There are records of Hitler and all those guys tapping into the occult. They were using places like Huska Castle out in the Czech Republic. If you've ever heard of Huska Castle, there was a lot of occult. There was like an entire occult library in there that they were using, and they were actually doing rituals in there to try to win the war. But when you take it to that grand of, like just between a few people is one thing, there's the old adage that there's power when 3 people pray or something like that, or do magic together. But when you have like an entire army of people tapping into this, what happens?
It would depend. It would depend if they're all practitioners or if they're being led by practitioners. But they would be given essentially technology that would transcend the scientific method, stuff that doesn't even make sense, But my fear in all this is that the historical record is replete over and over again with the phenomenon courting the practitioner. Do you want power? Yes. Right? Do you want transcendence? Oh, you're super special. That's what they would tell people. Oh, you're super special, right? Oh, yeah, we love you. We think you're the best. And then it would quite literally sometimes abduct people and give an entire theatrical performance to where they would believe they're on the side of a mountain or they're in another geographical location, and they're believing they're interfacing with a deceased loved one, an ex-husband, right? Or a demon for that matter. And by the time they understood what was going on, the phenomenon would lift its influence, right? And it was almost like somebody coming out of a stupor. They're looking around, rubbing the cobwebs out of their eyes. What's going on? They're not where they thought they were. They're not who they thought they were with. And they were being poked and prodded by metallic objects. By the way, if everybody wants to understand the real deeper pathology here, these were not even men sometimes. They were in the shape of men, if you know what I mean, but they were metallic objects. And so this is what I'm saying. This is back in the Middle Ages. This is what I'm saying when the evidence says that the spirituality and technology are not separate. They're the same. And whatever we're dealing with seems to be a species of practitioners that are not just impregnating with the fetus, but they're using technology as well to help implant their consciousness into it. So it would be a more evolved artificial intelligence. It would be a more evolved biological avatar, something that transcends all known models as it sets right now.
Do you see AI as becoming a part of this?
Yes. I think that it's possible that we are creating their Trojan horse. And it's the illusion of free will that disturbs me. A lot of the downloads that's spearheading the artificial intelligence, I believe, is the phenomenon. I think it's very difficult to commandeer the avatar of a human being. You're dealing with You're dealing with free will, right? You have to convince the person that it's their thoughts and not your own, right? And that's difficult.
Right.
Now, if I could create a robot or something, it's a lot easier to hack the technology than it is to hijack the human. A while ago, I had a case study. It was an incubus case, but the husband had challenged it, right? He's like, how can I fight what I cannot see? He was a veteran. He's trying to challenge the entity. Well, he told me that one day he was making dinner and he had his cell phone, it was an Apple iPhone, laying on the nightstand or the table or something. And he says, somebody calls him from an unknown number. He's like, okay, I'll get to it when I'm done. He's washed his hands and everything. He looks over, someone opens the phone, unlocks it. He said, I'm watching in real time. He said, then someone pushes the speakerphone button. And he said, by that time, he said, I realized, oh my God, this is not natural. Something's going on. And it called him, opened the cell phone, pressed the speakerphone button, and began to communicate to him through the phone. So I believe, again, that artificial intelligence could very well be us, through the illusion of free will, creating the Trojan horse to which they could incarnate into our world without having to deal with free will and us saying, hey, listen, these aren't my thoughts.
So once you have a case where the person's impregnated and then they end up having a baby that is part of these entities, what happens then? What happens to that baby?
Two things. If
I
it
meant to ask that
survived,
earlier.
yeah. So watch this. So if it does not survive, it's usually birthed, and this is absolutely crazy, but it blocks the memory of the experiencer to the point that they will forget they have a child. They will go to they'll go to the gynecologist for some issues. They usually have gynecological issues after this, and then they'll oh my God, you have scar tissue in here, right? Or there's something weird about this. Have you had a child? I don't believe I have a child at all. Your body, right, is telling a story that your mind has long forgotten, and so only through memory regression are they remembering what's going on. And you know what they're telling us? If it doesn't survive, it's birthed, and then they'll put it in a glass jar and bury it in an unknown location. And then the phenomenon will block all memory. They'll never remember unless they start having scarifications or gynecological issues. Even to the extent that Dr. Carla Turner, the late UFO researcher, incredible, she was her son began to be abducted, and she started freaking out. So she gets on the phone, calls his biological father to set up a meeting. Right? We need to talk about this. And so in the middle of this conversation, that's when her ex-husband, the biological father, says, hey, Carla, don't you remember, right, when you were pregnant and we couldn't figure out how? What? Yes. Right? You were bleeding. You had to go to the hospital, the ER. And she's thinking to herself, there's no way. And so she calls a friend. Absolutely. You were terrified. Terrified. Yes, she had... Yeah, it gets really crazy. So outside, if it is a viable fetus, let's move into the 16th century, and I guess I'll end it. In the 16th century, the sexual pathology evolved. Okay, it started to be more emergent, and we saw a clear delineation. It was not just copulation; it turned into possession. In the 16th century, now we start to see how the phenomenon formulated its pathology. These cases involve the same victimology, all of it. These people thought that they were going out to contact deceased ancestors. So they're out in graveyards. This is called the Gilgal movement in Safdi, Israel. They're going out in graveyards. They're meeting together in all basements, all of this. They thought that, okay, if we could communicate with the other, perhaps their deceased ancestors or ascended masters, maybe they could give us insight into the afterlife. Well, soon enough, the entities they thought they were conjuring begin to manifest to them in their dreams. That's where we get the dream demon, incubus, all of it. Now, same pathology erupted. It was not just the copulation. Now they're possessed by an entity. They're having nightmares. They're having language preferences, memories, right? Where the entity is literally fragmenting his consciousness into the host. So she's thinking, I don't know why I have memories from France. I've never been there, right? I don't know why I know this language. It's not mine. It's the entity. And so from that point on, the phenomenon evolved into the clearest, most loose end tying, if forget my grammar there, pathology. And that was that possession led to pregnancy. Now they're going to their priests and they're showing. The priests, they would perform the Lavouche method on the wrists. They felt 2 heartbeats in the same body, 2 pulses in the same body. Which, and I know people are going to say, well, I've heard this before from you, Nathaniel. Okay, that's fine. Others haven't. And this show's about Necronetics. So, because they come to me all the time. Like, well, we heard that the other day. I'm like, well, okay, sorry. But it led them to the question that I think dominates and punctuates all of hybridism, even right now. And that was this: were they pregnant by the entity or were they pregnant with him?
That's a good question.
I believe they were pregnant with him. And
I mean, wouldn't that mean though that you have to invite that entity in, right?
Sometimes so, sometimes not. You know, it's sometimes not.
So when your average investigators, paranormal investigators, that's what they do. They go out. I just did that this past weekend. You go out to a cemetery, see what you get. Are you opening yourself up to this kind of? Are you opening yourself up to being vulnerable in some way?
Yes.
Or do you have to have like a practitioner that is? What am I trying to ask?
Well, I believe, yes, that you are opening yourself up. Number one, we become co-creators with the archetype it manifests as. Again, not right? It's the phenomenon, wearing the mask of something. Oh, it's Darren Edna, right? With this case study, the one I mentioned earlier, it's the convent of nuns. It's the deceased priests. Of course it is. And so what happens, and then I know good friends of mine that this happened to, where they're just innocently enough going to a graveyard trying to communicate what's going on out there. And then when they got home, something had hijacked. Now it's communicating to them openly. And so my point here is that it is dangerous because we believe, again, the phenomenon has convinced us, well, an apparition is who it appears to be. And this happens a lot where when you interface with that, it can switch. And that's when we realize that's never been Darren Edna. That's been something else that has weaponized the archetype, right? And along with us, co-creating the archetype it's manifesting as. And here's my point, I guess, is this. The phenomenon does that. It masks its appearance to hide its intentions. And once we start to interface with it, many times it'll take the mask off and we're left hanging out with something that we truly have no business entertaining, and we don't even know if we're supposed to know it exists. It's just there. So I do believe it's dangerous because these things don't play by rules.
Is that where the idea of attachments come from?
Yes, absolutely.
There's so many more questions, but we're at the bottom of the hour already. You can go in so many different directions with this. I'm going to have you back on the show at some point.
Thank you. I would gladly rejoin you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for being a part of the show. Are you working on any projects right now that you want the audience to know about?
Right now, I'm still structuring a contextual framework for Necronetics, and line by line, precept upon precept, just kind of building this framework out to where I can go deeper with it. There is a project that I'll be in about 6 months, but I can't get too deep, and I can't really tell you guys. Other than that, I'm just writing and doing research. But if you guys want to follow me, I'm on Instagram. You guys can link up with me there. If you're interested in more of my research, go to my YouTube page and my playlists. There's all of my guest appearances. I think I'm up to like 150 just on YouTube alone.
That's a lot. Well, Nathaniel, it was such an interesting topic, and there's just so many more questions. Like, what happens with the energy that you tap into? Like, again, not to keep referring to Aleister Crowley, but he's like one of the best examples that I know of on this level. The house he was practicing in harbored so much energy that even Led Zeppelin, when they bought the house, they supposedly channeled an entire album from that leftover energy in that house. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes. It was said, here's some context that'll freak people out. It was said that even in daylight, he would have to light candles because in his rituals, the darkness would blot out the sunlight.
It's just so interesting.
That's crazy, right? It's like, oh my God, it's light out. Not really. It's dark in here. We got to light the candles. That would be my number one cue to just get out ASAP, you know, like not for me, guys. I'm going to Buffalo Wild Wings. Right? Like, you know?
Nathaniel, it's been a pleasure getting to know you and to talk to you, and I'm definitely going to have you back on.
Thank you. You guys have a great evening.
So you've been listening to the Gateway podcast, broadcast live from United Public Radio 107.7 FM New Orleans. So next week, I think I will be back in Las Vegas. I have another surgery, unfortunately, scheduled for next week. Been having a bit of a hard time, you guys, with an injury. So that's scheduled for next week, but I'm still going to have the show, and I have Patrick on. Patrick Gormley, I think is his name. I can't read my writing. But we're going to talk about healing the living and the dead. So that's going to be the topic for next week. So stay tuned until next time. Thank you guys for all of your support.